So in particular, Washington asks people to give up things that Du Bois thinks are absolutely essential to the development of Black people in the 20th century. And here's what he says. Mr. Washington distinctly asks that Black people give up, at least for the present, 3 things. First, political power. Second, insistence on civil rights. Third, higher education of Negro youth. And concentrate all their energies on industrial education and accumulation of wealth and the conciliation of the South. And, these are the things that Du Bois thinks are essential, and he argues that in conceding this, the reward that African Americans have gotten as a consequence is, the poll tax, which disenfranchised Black voters, the Jim Crow laws, which instituted racial discrimination, and reduced investment in Black colleges. So, so he says, look, we if we follow this program, what are we going to get for it? We're going to get the infringement of our rights, and we'll never be able to get these back if we concede them now. And so, in contrast, Du Bois's picture of what we should be striving for is the following. They, that is, Black people at the time, do not expect that the free right to vote, to enjoy civic rights, and be educated will come in a moment. They do not expect to see the bias and prejudices of years disappear at the blast of a trumpet. But they are absolutely certain that the way for a people to gain their reasonable rights is not by voluntarily throwing them away and insisting that they do not want them. That the way for a people to gain respect is not by continually belittling and ridiculing themselves. That on the contrary, Negroes must insist continually, in season and out of season, that voting is necessary to modern manhood, that color discrimination is barbarism, and that Black boys need education as well as white boys. And here, we can already see what we'll talk about in the next chapter, the difference between racial justice for men and racial justice for women. So what we want here is manhood. We want Black boys to have education and womanhood, and girls are not part of this conversation. And that's something to pay attention to throughout. That the focus is on men and the advancement of men in particular, and the role of women figures differently in the eyes of Du Bois, for better or worse. That's part of the argument about intersectionality and about the relationship between race and gender in terms of thinking about equality and the ends of oppression. So the vote and education are going to be the route to advancement, and that's in contrast to simply gaining wealth. So again, look at that contrast between the higher nature, the spirit attaining or seeking for knowledge and wisdom versus the kind of money-grubbing economics that Washington is suggesting. Another important difference between Washington and Du Bois is the determined public opposition to oppression. So rather than the kind of ridicule and self-abasement and assimilation, what Du Bois is suggesting is that that racism and legacy of slavery be acknowledged, be admitted by white people, and the responsibility for that legacy be assumed, and that this should be public, and this should be part of the conversation about what should happen, about the problem of being a Black person. This is what he says in terms of thinking about the causes and the solution for this historical injustice. First, slavery and race prejudice are potent, if not sufficient, causes of the Negro's position. Second, industrial and common school training were necessarily slow in planting because they had to await the black teachers trained by higher institutions, it being extremely doubtful if any essentially different development was possible. And certainly a Tuskegee, and the Tuskegee is the university, the training institute that Washington set up to train black men in service professions, to be builders and work on train cars and that sort of thing. So certainly a Tuskegee was unthinkable before 1880. So we needed education first. We needed to have colleges to train black people so that they could then go and train other people. And third, while it is a great truth to say that the Negro must strive and strive mightily to help himself, it is equally true that unless his striving be not simply seconded, but rather aroused and encouraged by the initiative of the richer and wiser environing group, he cannot hope for great success. So here Du Bois is pointing out the role of white people to assume responsibility for the legacy of racism, that it's not good enough to just, say, oh yeah, go ahead, make your nice institute and get nice jobs and that's all fine. But there needs to be active involvement by white people. It's interesting the way in which Du Bois talks about white people. He doesn't have a kind of monolithic vision of white people and what their response is, any more than he has a monolithic vision about who black people are. He recognizes that black people are different. There are different kinds of skills and abilities among black people, and similarly, there are different kinds of ways in which white people are going to be responsive or not to this kind of call for assuming responsibility. So higher up on the same page, this is Du Bois's description of the southern white person. Today, even the attitude of the southern whites toward blacks is not, as so many assume, in all cases the same. The ignorant southerner hates the Negro. The working men fear his competition. The money makers wish to use him as a laborer. Some of the educated see a menace in his upward development, while others, usually the sons of the masters, wish to help him rise. So there's a complexity in terms of whether and how white people are going to accept their responsibility and do what they are supposed to in terms of advancing the situation for black people. By and large, it's going to be one of opposition, but for different sorts of reasons. And that's really useful to be paying attention to, as in the contemporary case. We look for reasons that there are obstacles to ending racism. The obstacles to ending racism aren't just ignorance. So the ignorant southerner is one kind of person, a kind of person who just doesn't understand racial difference and just is stuck in a kind of outdated prejudice. So that's one form of racism. But there are lots of other forms of racism. So the working person who takes black people to be competitors. You're stealing my jobs. This is a common refrain that we still hear. Even educated people are threatened, by people with different ideas. We can see this with critical race theory. Well, critical race theory is a way of thinking about history, and that can be threatening. That can be threatening to educated people as well as to the ignorant white person. The moneymaker wants to use him as a laborer. So there are ways in which any kind of exploitation of the economic power of black people is considered valuable by some people, which can be utilized, ways in which the black consumer can gain recognition and more ads being featuring black people, for example, is a way to recognize that there are black people with money who can buy things, and getting people to work in your company. There's an entire vast resource of talented people that we ought to be using and not discriminating against. So so there are positive ways in which the economic value of an oppressed group can be used to ameliorate oppression, but it can also be exploited, and that's some of the ways that's some of the underlying message that Du Bois is giving us in that kind of list of what the different attitudes are of white people towards helping. Most curious to me is the suggestion that Du Bois has that the sons of the masters are the ones that he characterizes as wanting to help. That there are some white people who do want to help, that recognize their blame. And the sons of the masters might be the most important group as far as that goes. And it's useful to sort of think about why that would be. You might think of them, that they would be the ones who would be the sons of the would be the ignorant Southerners, and certainly there would be some of those. But they might be also the people most inclined to help, and it's worthwhile sort of thinking about, like why would that be? What would be the motivation of that group of people in particular for doing the right thing with respect to this newly freed class of people who are suffering?